blood, fire, and holy war. These were not the myths of ancient legends, but the daily tools of a man history both feared and reviled. Constantine V, Emperor of Byzantium. To some, he was a warrior king, a reformer, a savior of the Eastern Empire. To others, he was a heretic, a butcher of monks, and a tyrant who waged war not only on enemies, but on faith itself. But it was not the sword nor poison that would claim him. It was something far slower, far more grotesque. A torment that began in the flesh and ended with worms devouring his eyes. Why did one of the most powerful rulers in Eastern history die in such unspeakable horror? This is not just a story of disease. It is a tale of divine punishment, paranoia, holy vengeance, and the limits of imperial power. Welcome to the final days of Constantine V. In the winter of 718, as the Eastern Roman Empire stood at the edge of collapse, a child was born within the heavily guarded chambers of Constantinople. That child would become one of the most feared and controversial emperors Byzantium would ever know. Constantine V, son of Emperor Leo III. At the time of his birth, the Byzantine Empire was under siege, quite literally. Arab armies encircled Constantinople, battering its walls with fire and steel, while the people inside starved. Leo III, a military commander of humble Syrian origins, had risen from obscurity to lead the city's defenses. And through brilliant tactics, a brutal winter, and the use of Greek fire, he drove the invaders away. It was in this crucible of war that Constantine entered the world, not in peace, but amid suffering, fire, and survival. His very name, Constantine, evoked the founder of the Christian Empire. His bloodline now linked to divine destiny in the minds of his supporters. Constantine's youth was one of privilege, yes, but not softness. He was trained like a soldier, schooled in theology like a monk, and educated in rhetoric like an orator. While other royal children were coddled, Constantine was drilled, molded, and watched. His father, Leo III, saw not just a son, but an heir to an empire constantly under threat. Physically, Constantine grew into an impressive figure. He was tall, strong, and athletic, known for his skills in horseback riding and archery. Foreign envoys described him as charismatic, with sharp eyes and a commanding presence. Unlike some of his predecessors, who preferred luxury to leadership, Constantine embraced the military life, accompanying his father on campaigns as a teenager. But his popularity was far from universal. From a young age, Constantine was embroiled in theological conflict. His father had launched a fierce campaign against icon veneration, the worship of religious images, believing it to be heretical and corrupting. This iconoclastic stance earned the imperial family bitter enemies among monks, bishops, and the devout faithful. And as the emperor's son, Constantine was not spared. It was around this time that the nickname Kopronimos first emerged, dung-named. According to hostile chroniclers, the young Constantine soiled himself during baptism. Whether true or fabricated, the name stuck, repeated by enemies who would go on to accuse him of nearly every depravity imaginable. It became the rallying cry for those who saw the imperial family not as defenders of the faith, but as its destroyers. Despite the slanders, Constantine's position was secure for now. His father's reign brought a degree of stability to the empire. External threats were repelled. Reforms were enacted. But Leo III's death in 741 would shatter that fragile peace and thrust Constantine into a crisis that would define the rest of his life. At just 23 years old, Constantine ascended to the throne as Constantine V, Emperor of the Romans. His coronation was grand, traditional, filled with pomp and incense. But behind the golden curtains of the palace, a storm was brewing. His brother-in-law, Artabasdos, the commander of the Anatolic army and once a trusted general under Leo III, seized on the transition of power to stage a coup. In the months that followed, the empire descended into civil war. Two armies marched under two emperors. Two ideologies clashed, not just over politics, but over icons. Artabasdos, an iconophile, promised to restore the veneration of religious images. Constantine, raised in the iconoclastic faith, vowed to crush what he saw as heresy. The struggle was not just military, but deeply personal. Constantine had known Artabasdos his entire life. The betrayal was profound. Letters from the period suggest he took it as both a political and spiritual attack, an affront not only to his throne, but to his soul. And so, the Golden Prince began to harden. After months of bitter fighting, Constantine emerged victorious. He retook Constantinople, and with it, absolute power. But he did not forgive. Artabasdos was publicly humiliated, blinded, and exiled, a fate worse than death in Byzantine politics. His sons were similarly mutilated. Iconophile bishops were deposed. Monasteries that had supported the usurper were stripped of their wealth. The brutality was systematic, cold, calculated, and terrifying in its efficiency. What had once been a promising, youthful emperor, handsome, intellectual, trained in war and faith, had begun his reign with blood on his hands and hatred in his heart. The lines of his face deepened. His speeches grew more forceful, and his enemies began to multiply. But to his supporters, Constantine was not a tyrant. He was a savior. A true emperor in the mold of Constantine the Great. A man who had defended the empire from rebellion and stood against the corruption of idolatry. To them, his cruelty was necessary, righteous, holy. In this contradiction, hero and villain, savior and heretic, Constantine V began to carve his legacy. A legacy that would end, not with a sword, but with something far more nightmarish. When Constantine V retook Constantinople in 743, his victory was total, and his vengeance uncompromising. The usurper Artabasdos, once a trusted family member, now stood before him in chains. Publicly humiliated, he was paraded through the streets of the capital, his once proud face bloodied and broken. In a chilling display of imperial justice, Constantine ordered Artabasdos to be blinded. A punishment not just of pain, but of complete disempowerment. A blind man could never rule. His sons suffered the same fate. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not only be crushed, it would be erased. But Constantine's retaliation went far beyond personal vengeance. He understood something crucial. Fear was a tool. And now, with the throne secure, he would wield it to reshape the empire in his image. The Civil War had not been just a military confrontation. It had exposed deep ideological rifts within the Byzantine world. At the heart of this fracture was the issue of icon veneration. Artabasdos had gained support largely through the religious elite, monks, bishops, and the common faithful who viewed Constantine's iconoclasm as sacrilege. Constantine knew that if he wanted to preserve power, he had to silence this opposition, not just militarily, but spiritually. What followed was one of the most aggressive internal campaigns in Byzantine history. Constantine summoned a new church council in 754. The Council of Hieria, composed only of iconoclast bishops, carefully selected for their loyalty. Unsurprisingly, the council declared the veneration of icons a heresy. It legitimized the emperor's policies and allowed him to move from religious debate to outright suppression. Monasteries across the empire were raided, icon painting was outlawed, frescoes were scraped off church walls. Some monks, refusing to renounce their sacred images, had their hands mutilated. Others were forcibly tonsured or sent to labor camps. Constantine even banned the use of certain saints' names for newborns, a symbolic erasure of what he deemed idolatrous legacy. To enforce these decrees, Constantine expanded the imperial bureaucracy, appointing zealots to oversee religious enforcement. Reports flooded in of icons burned in public squares, of priests tortured for defiance, and of entire monastic communities disbanded. Constantine's army, once trained for war against foreign foes, now turned inward, becoming the enforcers of religious orthodoxy. And yet, amidst this terror, the empire prospered, at least on the surface. By the late 750s, Constantine had stabilized the frontiers. He had pushed back Arab incursions in the east and strengthened the Danube border in the Balkans. He reorganized the theme system, the Byzantine military administrative structure, to make the army more mobile and loyal. He reformed taxation, ensuring more consistent revenue. Infrastructure was repaired, aqueducts restored, grain supplies stabilized. To his supporters, these were the actions of a great reformer. The violence? A regrettable necessity. But there was another Constantine, one not found in official records, but in the whispered tales of monks and the frightened writings of iconophile chroniclers. According to these sources, Constantine's war on icons masked a deeper obsession, one bordering on the fanatical. He believed that the veneration of images had cursed the empire, that divine wrath was the reason for its past defeats. He saw himself as a chosen instrument of purification, cleansing Byzantium not only of heresy, but of the spiritual filth that had accumulated for centuries. This belief transformed his court. Where once theologians debated doctrine, now soldiers delivered decrees. Where once icons adorned the walls of palaces, now banners of the emperor's crest hung alone. The palace became a fortress, not just against physical enemies, but against symbols. Even his personal chapel was said to be devoid of any imagery, lit only by bare candles and echoing with silence. Outside the palace, the people murmured. Many obeyed in public, but in private, icons were hidden behind cupboards, buried beneath floorboards, even smuggled into neighboring territories. Some monks continued to paint in secret, believing martyrdom was better than compromise. Still, Constantine ruled unopposed. His grip on power was ironclad, his army loyal, his administration ruthless. And yet, even in this era of dominance, shadows began to creep in. Accounts from the late 760s suggest a change in Constantine. His speeches grew more erratic, his edicts more extreme. He began issuing punishments not only for icon veneration, but for merely questioning imperial policy. Spies were stationed in monasteries. Interrogations became common. Torture, once reserved for rebels and criminals, was now used on priests and scribes. At the same time, rumors swirled about the emperor's health. He had begun limping. Some claimed he wore padded boots to conceal ulcers. Others said he was in constant pain. Whatever the truth, it was clear something had shifted. Not just in his body, but in his mind. The man who had risen to power through discipline and conviction now appeared increasingly ruled by obsession and dread. Whispers of divine punishment began to circulate. Monks preached in hushed tones that the emperor's flesh was rotting for his crimes, that heaven would not be mocked, that the saints would have vengeance. Of course, in the imperial court, such talk was treason. Those caught were imprisoned, or worse. But still, the fear remained, not just among the people, but within Constantine himself. What began as a crusade to cleanse the empire had become a mirror, reflecting back his own decay. The prince who had risen through fire now stood alone at the summit, powerful, feared, and beginning to fall apart from the inside out. And it was only just beginning. To understand Constantine V, one must first understand what he feared. And what he feared most was the image. Not the sword, not the assassin, but the painted face of a saint. To Constantine, icons were not holy. They were threats, symbols of disorder, superstition, and rebellion. In his eyes, they represented the very weakness that had brought the empire to its knees in the past. Fractured authority, religious division, blind ritualism, and what he called a false vision of God. He believed that the use of religious imagery violated the second commandment, that worshiping Christ through wood and paint was no different than pagan idolatry. But more than theology, this was political. The iconophile movement, the worship of icons, had become a rallying point for opposition, particularly among monks, who often criticized imperial overreach. Monasteries were powerful, wealthy, educated, and independent. And for Constantine, that made them dangerous. So began what history would remember as the iconoclast persecutions. After consolidating power through civil war, Constantine moved swiftly. He ordered the destruction of icons across the empire. This was not merely a decree, it was a campaign. Imperial agents were dispatched to churches, monasteries, and even private homes. Sacred images were ripped from altars. Frescoes depicting saints were whitewashed. Golden icons were melted down, their materials recycled into imperial currency or military equipment. The Council of Hieria, held in 754 and entirely composed of hand-picked iconoclast bishops, gave Constantine theological cover. The council denounced the veneration of images as heretical and decreed their destruction. With this declaration, icon veneration was not just discouraged, it was criminalized. Punishments were severe. Monks who resisted were publicly flogged. Some had their beards torn out by imperial guards. Others were branded on the face with hot irons. One account tells of an elderly monk who refused to renounce an icon of Christ. His hand was chopped off, and the icon nailed to the stump. His name was never recorded, but in secret circles, he became a martyr. Entire monasteries were emptied, properties confiscated, libraries burned, scrolls destroyed. Constantine viewed this not as desecration, but purification. He imagined himself as a new kind of holy warrior, one fighting not barbarians, but spiritual corruption. One whose enemy was not the enemy outside the gate, but within the chapel. He even rewrote church liturgy to remove references to saints associated with icons. Shrines were rededicated. Clergy were required to swear oaths of loyalty to the new doctrine. And those who refused, they vanished. But for all his ruthlessness, Constantine remained immensely popular with the military. His reforms had strengthened the empire's army. His foreign policy kept invaders at bay. He rewarded loyal soldiers with land and tax exemptions. He maintained roads and rebuilt infrastructure destroyed in earlier invasions. In Anatolia and Thrace especially, the common soldiery praised him as a protector of stability and Roman glory. This loyalty gave him something far more dangerous than a throne. It gave him confidence without limits. He began targeting not only religious imagery, but religious figures. Monks, bishops, even devout laypeople who dared question his authority were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. His secret police infiltrated monasteries. Letters were intercepted. Sermons were monitored. His palace became a network of informants and whispers. One particularly chilling policy involved the forced conscription of monks into the army. Monks, who had taken vows of non-violence, were handed weapons and armor, ordered to drill alongside regular soldiers. Those who refused were beaten or mutilated. To Constantine, this was poetic justice. Turn the cowardly cloistered critics into tools of the state, or break them trying. Meanwhile, underground resistance grew. Icons were painted in secret. Small gatherings held midnight services before hidden relics. Word spread of miracles, of icons bleeding when struck, of blind men healed after touching sacred wood. Whether true or not, these stories fueled defiance. In the imperial court, however, the emperor brooked no dissent. One of the few bishops brave enough to challenge Constantine publicly was Stephen the Younger, a respected abbot in Constantinople. Stephen condemned iconoclasm as heresy, even calling the emperor a second Judas. He was arrested, dragged through the streets, and beaten to death with clubs by a mob of soldiers. His body was displayed in the square as a warning. The people called him a saint. Constantine called him a traitor. But the emperor was not merely a brute. He believed deeply that he was right. He penned theological treatises defending his policies. He held debates with iconophile prisoners, though he always ensured they lost. He even sponsored artwork that celebrated iconoclasm, mosaics and inscriptions glorifying the destruction of images, replacing saints with imperial victories. This replacement of the divine with the imperial was no accident. For Constantine, power was holy, but only when centralized. He sought not to destroy faith, but to purify it into obedience. To him, saints were dead men. The living emperor was the true defender of the church. But as his policies grew harsher, cracks began to form. Tensions rose within the court. Some nobles, uneasy with the brutality, began to distance themselves. Foreign powers condemned the persecution. Even the Pope in Rome, though far removed, excommunicated iconoclast leaders. The empire stood increasingly isolated, religiously severed from the West, internally divided, and spiritually unsettled. Yet Constantine pushed forward. In 766, a conspiracy was uncovered. 19 high-ranking officials, including generals and clergy, were accused of plotting to assassinate the emperor. The punishment was swift and public. The conspirators were paraded through the hippodrome, beaten, their eyes gouged out. Their tongues were torn out and their ears cut off. Some were burned alive. The spectacle was meant to instill terror, and it did. But it also revealed something else, that even at the height of his power, Constantine V was a man surrounded by fear and fueled by it. He had won his war on icons, but at what cost? The streets were quieter, Churches were bare, the people obedient yet watching. And somewhere in the dark, hands still painted hidden saints beneath flickering candlelight. The war, it seemed, was not over. It had only gone underground. By the early 770s, the emperor's presence remained commanding, his armies loyal, and his decrees law. But beneath the golden robes and the iron will, Constantine V's body was betraying him. It began subtly, or so the records suggest. A limp that worsened over time, an unusual stiffness in the mornings, discoloration in the lower legs. Whispers spread within the palace. The emperor was sick, but no one dared say it aloud. In Byzantium, illness in an emperor was not a private matter. It was a political one. A weak body invited plots, conspiracies, invasions. And Constantine had made too many enemies for that secret to last forever. The first public signs came during a religious procession in Constantinople. According to a court chronicler, Constantine stumbled while climbing the steps to Hagia Sophia. Attendants rushed to steady him, and though he smiled and waved to the crowd, those close enough could see his face had gone pale, and his legs shook. Soon after, he withdrew from public appearances for weeks. By the time he returned, he was riding a covered litter instead of his horse. His armor was looser, the cloth beneath padded. His gait was slow. He began appearing less in military drills and more frequently behind closed doors with his physicians. Contemporary sources diverge wildly in describing the disease that afflicted him. Iconophile writers, eager to see divine punishment in action, claimed he was rotting from within, that sores covered his body, that worms infested his flesh. Others reported constant fevers, violent stomach pains, and recurring episodes of delirium. Some modern historians suggest he may have suffered from type 2 diabetes, osteomyelitis, a severe bone infection, or even parasitic infestation like ocular myiasis, a rare condition where fly larvae burrow into the tissues of the eye socket. Whatever the truth, one fact remains consistent across all accounts. His condition was horrifying. An Armenian envoy wrote that during a meeting, he was overwhelmed by the sweet, rotting stench surrounding the emperor's throne. The emperor's face, once strong and sharp, had grown bloated and mottled, and his eyes watery and distant. Some claimed the whites of his eyes had turned yellow. Others said they bulged grotesquely from the sockets. Behind closed doors, physicians applied foul-smelling pastes cut into flesh to drain pus, and recited prayers over a body that would not heal. The imperial medical team, though educated by Byzantine standards, operated in the dark by today's measures. They prescribed bloodletting, purgatives, incense, and poultices made from crushed herbs, lard, and wine. At one point, they bound his legs with cloth soaked in goat's milk and vinegar, hoping to draw out the foul spirits. Another account tells of hot irons being applied to his thighs, attempting to burn away corruption. None of it worked. Worse, his symptoms intensified. Ulcers opened along his legs and groin. The skin blackened in places, splitting and oozing. The emperor began experiencing violent chills, followed by sweating so profuse that his bedclothes were soaked through each night. It soon became impossible for him to walk without assistance. By 774, Constantine was no longer attending military councils in person. He dispatched generals with sealed orders instead, speaking only through written correspondence. When forced to appear, he remained seated, heavily veiled, with incense burners surrounding him, not as a spiritual act, but to mask the stench of infection. The court adapted. Few spoke of his condition openly. Ministers bowed lower. Guards were told to avert their eyes. Only his most loyal aides and a handful of physicians were permitted into his chambers. Yet behind the silence, a storm was brewing. The people were growing restless. The iconophile underground had begun using Constantine's illness as proof of divine wrath. Secret sermons declared, "The hand that struck the saints now festers in its sin." Monks wrote tracts describing visions in which the emperor was eaten alive by worms, his soul dragged screaming by the saints he had persecuted. Even some of Constantine's allies began to falter. One general reportedly refused to serve on campaign until the emperor was declared clean. A bishop loyal to the iconoclast cause left court under mysterious circumstances, never to return. Foreign emissaries began asking probing questions about the emperor's health, disguised as concern, but loaded with implications of succession. Within the palace, Constantine raged. He accused servants of poisoning his food. He demanded investigations into his physicians. He fired longtime aides, replacing them with men of military background rather than court etiquette. He began issuing edicts from his bedside, new laws banning gatherings of monks larger than 3. He doubled punishments for icon veneration and ordered any correspondence with Rome intercepted. But even in his fury, his body continued to rot. By early 775, the emperor could no longer rise from bed unassisted. He was fed through cloths soaked in broth. His legs had to be cleaned daily with wine and ash. One physician recorded that his left eye had begun to cloud over, oozing pus, and that larvae, possibly maggots, had been found in the wound. It is this moment that gave rise to the enduring legend that worms ate the emperor's eyes. Whether this was literal truth or iconophile propaganda, the image took hold. Even centuries later, Byzantine writers referenced Constantine's death not as a matter of disease, but as a judgment. Physical corruption as reflection of spiritual rot. And in his darkest moments, perhaps Constantine believed it too. He reportedly awoke screaming, claiming to see the faces of saints, Stephen the Younger, John of Damascus, even the Virgin Mary, hovering over his bed, eyes weeping blood. He ordered icons found and smashed. He made priests swear that heaven had forgiven him. He demanded a relic be placed under his pillow, then burned it the next day. The emperor who had once mocked images now feared them, not as false idols, but as witnesses. His screams, once heard in the Senate, now echoed through palace corridors. The man who had ruled by fire was being devoured by it. By 775, Constantine V was no longer the commander of legions, nor the voice thundering in the Senate. He had become a pale figure wrapped in linens, hidden behind veils and incense, reduced to groans and violent outbursts. But perhaps more terrifying than the physical decay of the emperor was the unraveling of his mind. The man who once dictated military strategy with sharp precision now vacillated between moments of clarity and episodes of hysteria. He would sit for hours in silence, staring at the flickering shadow of a candle, only to suddenly explode in fits of rage, ordering arrests, screaming at shadows, or accusing his closest advisors of treason. Court attendants were instructed to enter the emperor's chamber without making eye contact. Any perceived disrespect, a glance too long, a step too loud, could be met with violent punishment. Some were beaten, others disappeared. The palace, once a hive of bureaucracy and ritual, had become a place of whispers and fear. The paranoia had taken hold completely. Constantine began to believe that the monks were plotting his death through prayer. He insisted that holy men across the empire were using icons, still hidden despite decades of persecution, to cast curses against him. He issued a fresh wave of edicts. All monasteries were to be inspected. All monks and nuns required to register with local officials. Any found possessing or creating icons would face public punishment without trial. What followed was a new wave of raids and arrests. In the city of Nicaea, a small monastery was burned to the ground after 3 monks refused to confess to owning sacred images. In Thrace, an abbot was dragged by horses through the village square for writing prayers for the emperor's recovery, which Constantine interpreted as a veiled mockery. Even members of the imperial family were not spared his suspicion. One of Constantine's nephews, a rising general, was placed under house arrest after the emperor accused him of harboring sympathy for saints. Another courtier was executed for allegedly wearing a pendant of St. Nicholas beneath his robe. The man begged for mercy, declaring it had belonged to his mother. Constantine watched the execution from a shaded litter, saying only, "Let the saints save him now." As his condition worsened, so too did his dreams. Eyewitness accounts, mostly from later chronicles or servant diaries, described the emperor screaming in the night, calling out to those he had executed. Stephen the Younger, Artabazdos, even his own blameless former allies. He claimed they came to him in visions, cloaked in blood, pointing at him wordlessly. On some nights, he demanded the room be flooded with light, refusing to be alone in the dark. On others, he insisted all icons in the palace be burned again, even though none remained. The symbolism became more erratic. He ordered his food to be served only on plates without images, not of saints, not of birds, not even decorative vines. He refused to drink from chalices unless they were plain iron. He declared certain colors cursed. Red, he claimed, made the ghosts come closer. His physicians, overwhelmed, tried everything. Tinctures of opium dulled his pain, but clouded his mind further. Herbal tonics only made him vomit. Incantations from palace priests had no effect. In desperation, one court doctor proposed an exorcism, a move that nearly cost him his life. Constantine accused him of implying demonic possession, which he took as both insult and threat. The physician was exiled the next morning. Within the emperor's private chambers, life became a waking nightmare. Walls were lined with fresh linen every week to keep the odor of rotting flesh from clinging. Buckets of herbs and ash were scattered beneath his bed. Servants worked in shifts, scrubbing blood and pus from the emperor's legs, which now appeared almost skeletal beneath blackened skin. Some accounts claim his eyes had gone completely blind, milky and swollen, constantly weeping fluid that had to be wiped away hourly. And yet, amid all this decay, Constantine refused to relinquish control. He continued issuing decrees, even when his hands trembled so violently that aides had to hold the parchment still. He revised laws, signed off on executions, and scrawled furious letters condemning Rome and its idolatrous pope. He demanded reports from the frontiers and berated generals for minor failures. His voice, though weakened, still carried the weight of an emperor, and his court, fearing retribution, obeyed. But the empire was changing. The people, long subdued by fear, began to sense the cracks in imperial armor. Resistance became bolder. Underground churches grew in number. Pilgrimages to the tombs of martyred monks increased. In marketplaces, it was whispered that the emperor was already dead, and that a double now ruled in his name. Foreign powers noticed as well. The Frankish king Charlemagne sent envoys to Constantinople, ostensibly to discuss trade, but truly to assess the emperor's health. Reports sent back west spoke of a ruler in shadow, seldom seen, never speaking directly, and shrouded in incense. Rumors swirled that Constantine had gone mad, or worse, that the throne was cursed. And inside his palace, Constantine descended further. In his final months, he reportedly demanded that any newborn child named after a saint be renamed. He canceled scheduled religious festivals and banned processions in the capital. He ordered all candles in the city to be extinguished at sunset on certain nights, claiming that the darkness must have its due. The emperor who once stood for reform now existed in ritualistic dread, consumed not by external enemies, but by ghosts of his own making. His final known public act was a decree commanding that any monk found near a military outpost be considered a spy and executed on sight. This decree was not signed in the throne room, nor in council, but from his sickbed, the parchment stained with what may have been blood, sweat, or infection. Constantine had become a prisoner of his own palace, surrounded by loyal guards and fearful servants, haunted by the very saints he had tried to erase. His war against icons had become a war against memory, and memory in Byzantium never stayed buried for long. By the summer of 775, the empire held its breath. Constantine V, once the Golden Prince, the victorious general, the scourge of icons, was now little more than a disfigured shadow, carried from room to room like a relic of a fallen age. His body, racked by disease, was ravaged beyond recognition. His legs were little more than bone and ulcer. His eyes, once fierce and calculating, had either clouded with blindness or, as some claimed, had been consumed by parasites. His skin hung in folds of jaundiced mold flesh, and his voice cracked like dry parchment. And yet, in a final act of defiance, he ordered one last campaign. The Bulgars, a formidable force to the north, had begun pressing against Byzantine defenses along the Danube. Skirmishes were escalating, and though Constantine was in no state to ride, let alone fight, he insisted on leading the army himself. It was a decision as mad as it was symbolic. Some say he feared dying in his bed, surrounded by whispers and priests. Others claim he believed a final victory in battle might cleanse his soul, or at least distract from the grotesque spectacle of his condition. Whatever the reason, he left Constantinople on a litter, wrapped in veils, flanked by elite guards and terrified physicians. The army, too loyal or too afraid to object, followed. The journey north was slow, agonizing. Constantine was unable to sit upright for long. He was carried like a corpse through forests and along coastal roads, coughing blood and issuing orders between fits of fever. At each camp, his tent was filled with the scent of burning herbs to mask the rot. His food was spoon-fed. His commands were dictated to scribes who often wept silently while writing. By the time the imperial force reached Strongylos, a strategic outpost near the Bulgar border, Constantine was no longer speaking clearly. Witnesses reported that his words came in bursts of clarity, followed by long stretches of muttering. He referred to generals by the names of dead men. He insisted the army be blessed by icons, forgetting that he himself had outlawed them. He asked to speak to his father, Leo III, and grew enraged when no one could find him. And yet, he still ruled. Even dying, Constantine signed decrees. He named temporary governors. He wrote a letter denouncing Rome for heresy and accused the Pope of conspiring with demons. He demanded executions of deserters, even as his own body deserted him, inch by inch. The end came suddenly, but not quietly. On September 14th, 775, just before dawn, the emperor suffered what modern historians believe was a massive stroke. His right side became paralyzed. His breathing grew erratic, shallow. One aide described his mouth twisting, his tongue lolling out, eyes rolling back into skull-like sockets. Physicians applied hot compresses, prayed aloud, and even burned incense directly beneath his nostrils in a desperate attempt to stimulate his senses. It was all in vain. By midday, his tent was sealed. Only his most trusted confidants and his son, Leo IV, were allowed to enter. Outside, soldiers gathered in silence, hearing only occasional gasps from within, and once, a long, guttural scream. That scream would be remembered. Some say it was pain, others say it was fear. Iconophile chroniclers later claimed that, in his final moments, Constantine saw the ghosts of the saints he had martyred, that they stood around his bed, not speaking, only watching. Some said he tried to rise and flee, but his body refused. One monk, writing decades later, described it this way: the emperor rose against heaven with sword and fire. In return, the Lord rose against his flesh, and when the worm reached his eye, he saw the truth. It is likely legend, and yet his suffering was real. When the tent was finally unsealed at sunset, those who entered found a ruin of a man, twisted in death, his eyes collapsed inward, mouth frozen in a half snarl, half prayer. His body was drenched in sweat and blood. One attendant claimed maggots had already begun feeding on the open wounds along his legs. Despite the horror, imperial protocol had to proceed. The corpse was wrapped in perfumed linens, though the stench was overpowering. Embalmers worked through the night, removing internal organs, packing the cavities with myrrh and crushed resin. A death mask was cast, though most artists refused to look directly at the face, relying instead on older portraits. The body was placed in a reinforced coffin and draped with the imperial purple. Official cause of death, natural causes. Unofficially, many whispered of divine retribution. Back in Constantinople, the news spread cautiously. The Senate was convened in secret. The palace was draped in black. Church bells tolled. But unlike the mourning that followed other emperors, Constantine's death was met with silence by many, and celebration by others. Monks who had long prayed in secret now dared to sing psalms of thanksgiving. Some came out of hiding. Others gathered at the tombs of iconophile martyrs and lit candles. In one monastery, a painting of Christ, hidden for decades behind a false wall, was revealed and kissed by weeping monks. "The dragon is dead," one abbot reportedly said. Constantine's body was returned to the capital under heavy guard. Crowds lined the streets, unsure whether to bow or turn away. The man who had declared himself the savior of orthodoxy was now being wheeled past icons he had once ordered destroyed. His funeral was grand, as protocol demanded. But behind the chants and incense, the priests spoke carefully. The patriarch, though a loyal iconoclast, delivered a eulogy full of vague allusions, praising the empire more than the man. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles near other emperors. His tomb, simple yet formidable, bore no images, only inscriptions of victory and divine mission. But within a generation, that tomb would fall into disrepair. Later emperors, especially those who restored icon veneration, would avoid it. By the 10th century, it was rarely visited at all. Constantine V, once the most powerful man in the Christian world, was slowly forgotten, except in the minds of those who remembered what he destroyed, and in the minds of those who believed he had been destroyed by something greater than death itself. When Constantine V exhaled his final breath in the blood-scented tent near Strongylos, an empire exhaled with him, not in mourning, but in nervous anticipation. The death of a Byzantine emperor was always dangerous. It created a moment of vacuum where loyalties could shift, enemies could strike, and suppressed factions might rise. But Constantine's death? That was something more profound. It was the death of a regime defined by fear and by fire. The imperial court, trained in obedience, moved swiftly to manage the transition. Leo IV, Constantine's son by his third wife, Irene of Khazaria, was already proclaimed co-emperor, and his accession passed without open resistance. Constantine had ensured succession through years of purges and manipulation. No surviving general had enough power to challenge the heir. The army, though shaken, remained loyal. Yet even as Leo IV assumed the purple, a quiet revolution began. The first signs came from the monasteries. For decades, monks had lived under siege, beaten, branded, forced into silence. But with the tyrant dead, they emerged like roots cracking stone. In remote chapels, hidden icons were retrieved from behind false panels. Relics, long buried beneath floorboards, were kissed once more. The icons of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and martyred saints were placed back on altars. Processions returned, and chants long forbidden rose through the air again. The monks called it a miracle. To the faithful, it was nothing less than the restoration of holiness. For years they had prayed that God would intervene. Now they believed he had, not with fire from heaven, but with the slow decay of an emperor who thought himself untouchable. Yet not all shared their joy. In the imperial court, many who had risen under Constantine's iconoclast policies now feared for their positions and their lives. Bishops who had endorsed persecution, generals who had carried out raids, scribes who had signed off on torture, all began to hedge their loyalty. Some wrote panicked letters to Leo IV, affirming their faith in his leadership. Others attempted to frame Constantine's iconoclasm as misguided zeal, hoping to distance themselves from the worst abuses. And what of Leo IV himself? He had grown up in a court defined by paranoia. He had watched his father rage against icons, against monks, against shadows. But Leo was not his father. He was cautious, intelligent, and above all, pragmatic. He understood that the empire was exhausted, that further persecution would tear the state apart, that compromise was not weakness, but survival. So, Leo began to ease restrictions. He quietly halted monastery inspections. He ceased the arrest of iconophiles. He released several monks who had been imprisoned under Constantine's rule. And though he never publicly renounced iconoclasm, doing so would have undermined his own claim to power. He allowed religious images to reappear in private spaces. It was not a full restoration, but it was enough. The people called him Leo the Mild, but the wounds his father left ran deep. Across the empire, stories emerged. Families who had lost sons to monastery raids, Villages where icons had been burned in public fires. Churches where walls still bore the scars of chisels that scraped away sacred faces. The trauma was not just physical, it was spiritual. Entire generations had grown up without saints, without paintings of Christ, without the gentle presence of holy images watching over them. And in this spiritual vacuum, a hunger took root. People began creating icons in secret. They commissioned new ones in workshops, hidden beneath homes, painted by elderly monks with trembling hands. Styles varied, crude, beautiful, improvised. Some icons depicted Constantine himself burning in hell, surrounded by the saints he had martyred. Others showed Stephen the Younger triumphant, holding a bloodied cross over a defeated dragon. It was not just art, it was resistance. And the resistance had other forms. In the capital, pamphlets began to circulate. Illegal writings copied by hand and distributed in markets, bathhouses, and taverns. They told stories of Constantine's final hours, emphasizing the grotesque nature of his death. That his eyes had been devoured by worms, that his flesh split like overripe fruit, that no priest had come to hear his last confession. Whether true or not, these stories became legend. The most famous pamphlet bore the title, "The Emperor Who Could Not See the Light." It described in lurid detail how Constantine's eyes had decayed from within, how the saints had cursed him, and how his corpse had to be buried quickly for fear it would poison the air. Copies of this account made their way to Rome, to Alexandria, even to Baghdad. The narrative had escaped the empire's control. The emperor was no longer a ruler. He was a cautionary tale. Even in death, Constantine was dividing Byzantium. Iconoclast officials tried to defend his memory. In public speeches, they emphasized his military victories, his administrative reforms, his contributions to infrastructure. They spoke of his discipline, his vision, his legacy as a restorer of strength. But those speeches were increasingly ignored. Instead, people turned to oral storytelling. In village courtyards, elders told children how the emperor who blinded monks had gone blind himself, how he had outlawed saints only to be haunted by them, how the man who tried to rewrite heaven had been dragged into the grave by the hands he cut from others. Fact and fiction blended, fused by faith and fury. Constantine's image became grotesque, a worm-infested corpse in a purple robe, gasping for breath as the saints he murdered looked on. His tomb became a site of ambiguity. Located in the Church of the Holy Apostles, it was simple and cold. No icons, no flowers, no pilgrims. Where other emperors had candles lit in their honor, Constantine had silence. No feast day marked his reign. No cleric spoke prayers over his grave. It was as if the church itself had chosen to forget him, not by erasing him, but by refusing to speak his name. Over time, his reputation fractured. To later iconoclast emperors, especially Leo V and Constantine V's grandson, he was a hero, a martyr for true doctrine. They praised him in military manuals and theological texts. But to the majority of the faithful, Constantine V became the heretic emperor, the cursed ruler, the man whom God punished with rot and blindness. His legacy was now a battleground, and Byzantium was far from finished with his ghost. Time, it is said, judges more harshly than any man. For Constantine V, that judgment has never been settled. Across centuries, scholars, theologians, generals, and emperors have argued. Was he a visionary reformer who saved the Byzantine Empire from internal collapse? Or was he a paranoid tyrant whose war against icons left a spiritual scar that never fully healed? The truth, as it often is in history, might be between the extremes. Let us begin with what cannot be denied. Constantine V was a military genius. During his reign, he reorganized the Byzantine army into a more flexible, responsive force. He modernized the theme system, ensuring regional forces could both defend borders and suppress internal revolts. His campaigns against the Arabs were aggressive and, for the most part, successful. He reclaimed lost territories in Anatolia, reinforced the Danube frontier, and re-established imperial presence in contested regions. His navy was revitalized, Greek fire was employed with new efficiency, and his engineers rebuilt walls, roads, and aqueducts that had been neglected since Justinian's era. Historians who admire Constantine often point to these achievements as evidence that he restored imperial strength during a time of severe vulnerability. After a century of religious division, foreign invasions, and plague, Constantine brought order, harsh, rigid, but undeniably effective. The Byzantine treasury was stabilized. Agricultural reforms were implemented. Urban centers began to grow again. By these measures, he might have been remembered as one of Byzantium's great emperors. But history does not measure greatness by power alone. It also measures by cost. And the cost of Constantine's rule was immense. His iconoclasm, even when stripped of theological arguments, unleashed a wave of cultural and human destruction. Monasteries, centers of education, charity, and art were desecrated. Thousands of sacred images were destroyed. Walls that once bore the serene eyes of saints were scraped clean, painted over with imperial crests. Libraries were burned, scholars imprisoned, a generation of artists silenced. The spiritual trauma inflicted during this time, especially upon the common faithful, cannot be easily quantified. But it echoes in the writings of the time. Letters of desperation, poems of exile, and laments written in blood and ash on monastery walls. One monk, writing decades after Constantine's death, captured the pain with chilling clarity. He thought he was Moses, but he broke not the idols of Egypt, he shattered the faces of Christ. Modern historians, particularly in the West, have long debated whether Constantine's motivations were theological or political. Was his iconoclasm born from sincere belief in avoiding idolatry? Or was it a calculated effort to undermine the independent power of the church, especially monasteries that threatened imperial authority? The answer is likely both. Constantine was a zealot with a sword, a believer who also knew that icons were banners behind which his enemies gathered. He used religion as both armor and weapon. He declared war not on faith, but on the symbols of faith that he could not control. His theological treatises, though dismissed by later Orthodox thinkers, reveal a mind deeply engaged with scripture and doctrine. Yet his actions reveal a ruler who saw obedience as holiness and defiance as heresy, regardless of motive. And then, there is the matter of his death. The grotesque details, his flesh rotting, his eyes consumed by worms, his final screams heard through silk-draped tents, have become legend. Iconophile chroniclers gleefully portrayed his final days as divine retribution, comparing him to Pharaoh, Herod, and Judas. But even modern medicine lends these accounts some credibility. Retrospective diagnoses suggest he may have suffered from complications of untreated diabetes, parasitic infection, gangrene, or osteomyelitis. All conditions that, without antibiotics or advanced surgical care, would lead to the kind of slow, putrid death described in the sources. And while religious bias colors many of the records, the consistency of certain details, particularly the blindness, the leg ulcers, the hallucinations, suggest that Constantine did, in fact, suffer immensely before he died. His agony became part of his legacy. In Byzantine sermons, his story was retold not as history, but as warning. The emperor who denied the saints was denied mercy. The man who blinded others died blind. The king who silenced the church died in screams. Yet others, especially during the brief revivals of iconoclasm under Leo V and Constantine's descendants, sought to rehabilitate his image. They called him Constantine the New Moses, a purifier who tore down idols and restored true worship. They emphasized his military victories, his economic reforms, his administrative genius. They painted his iconoclasm not as heresy, but as holy reform, misunderstood by weak men and corrupt priests. During the iconoclastic revival of the early 9th century, his tomb was cleaned, his name praised in court liturgies, and mosaics honoring his campaigns were restored. Yet this revival was short-lived. After the final restoration of icon veneration in 843, his name fell into disgrace again, and his image, once carved into church panels, was quietly removed. Today, Constantine V remains one of Byzantium's most polarizing figures. To the Orthodox Church, he is a cautionary tale, an emperor who turned against tradition and paid with body and soul. To military historians, he is a pragmatic reformer who saved an empire on the brink. To art historians, he is the man who oversaw one of the greatest cultural destructions in Christian history. But to storytellers, to those who keep alive the whispered legends, he is something more primal. He is the emperor whose rage ate the saints, and whose flesh was eaten in return. He is the sovereign who silenced prayer, only to die begging for it. He is the lesson that power, when untethered from grace, always turns on itself. And for that, Constantine V will never be forgotten, not in books, not in chants, and not in the eyes of icons that still stare out from monastery walls. The tomb of Constantine V was built to inspire awe, a resting place for an emperor, a son of Leo III, a ruler who had defended the empire's borders and reformed its laws. Constructed of fine marble, adorned not with images, but with imperial symbols, the sarcophagus was designed to speak of strength, legacy, and continuity. But what it could not conceal was the rot. In the decades that followed his death, the tomb stood mostly untouched, visited rarely, prayed over almost never. Even during state ceremonies, when other imperial graves were honored, Constantine's received only a passing mention, if any at all. Unlike his predecessors, he was not celebrated. Unlike his successors, he was not forgiven. What had once been a monument became a warning. As time passed, stories began to grow, not within state chronicles, but in whispered tales passed from mother to son, monk to novice. Stories that worms still crawled through the emperor's coffin, that no icon would stay mounted on the wall above his grave, that priests who approached his tomb too closely reported chills, strange whispers, the smell of decay. Rational minds dismissed these tales as superstition. But Byzantium was not a rational empire. It was an empire of signs and symbols, where spiritual truth often carried more weight than empirical fact. And in the case of Constantine V, the physical and the symbolic intertwined too tightly to separate. His body, riddled with disease, consumed by ulcers and parasites, became a living metaphor for the empire under iconoclasm. Just as his flesh decayed, so too did the spiritual unity of Byzantium. Just as his eyes collapsed inward, so too had the church turned blind to compassion, to tradition, to beauty. And just as his body had been veiled in incense to hide the smell of rot, the empire had wrapped itself in censorship, fear, and doctrine to cover the stench of persecution. The phrase "the rotting crown" first appeared in the writings of a monk from Mount Athos, nearly 50 years after Constantine's death. He did not name the emperor directly, but the reference was unmistakable. There was a king once, mighty in war, but hollow in the soul. His crown bore no saints, and his tomb no light. And though men feared him in life, in death they feared the silence more. The image stuck. Artists of the next generation began painting anonymous emperors in stages of decay, their faces cracked, their robes eaten by moths, their eyes missing. They painted scenes of judgment, where tyrants faced saints in heavenly courts. They told tales in which worms whispered truth that bishops were too afraid to speak. But these were not just expressions of theological vengeance. They were the beginnings of a cultural reckoning, one that asked a difficult question. What had Byzantium become during the iconoclast era? What had been gained, and what had been lost? Historians today continue to debate Constantine V's legacy. On paper, his reign was marked by military stability, administrative discipline, and relative prosperity. He held the empire together during a time of chaos. He strengthened the army. He reasserted imperial control over rebellious regions. He avoided the excesses of luxury that had corrupted so many emperors before him. But in doing so, he crushed a part of Byzantium's soul. By stripping churches of imagery, he severed a connection between the divine and the people. By persecuting monks, he weakened one of the empire's intellectual and moral foundations. And by reducing faith to enforcement, he reshaped religion into a tool of control, hollow, cold, and afraid. It was said that his crown bore no saints, a rare feat in Byzantium, where emperors often surrounded themselves with imagery of holy figures to legitimize their rule. Constantine preferred military banners, swords, and his own likeness. Where other rulers prayed to saints before battle, Constantine declared himself God's instrument and acted without intercessors. This self-reliance became self-destruction. In the final years of his reign, no saint stood by his side, no relic beneath his pillow. The church did not bless his recovery. The people did not plead for his health. When he died, his enemies rejoiced, not out of spite alone, but out of relief. The silence of his tomb was not accidental. It was chosen, and that silence became contagious. For decades, no Byzantine emperor dared invoke Constantine's name in sermons or ceremonies. When Leo V later revived iconoclasm, he did so in the name of Leo III, Constantine's father, not Constantine himself. Even among those who admired his doctrine, Constantine V was a liability. Too violent, too extreme, too cursed. Only in some military manuals and marginal texts was he remembered as a figure of strength, and even there, never affection. His crown, the literal one, was stored in the treasury and never used again. Later emperors preferred coronation regalia linked to Justinian or to Basil I. Constantine's symbols were seen as impure, stained by blood and heresy. Even attempts to restore his image through coinage failed. People refused to carry his likeness. Merchants scratched his face from currency. Some melted it down to erase the curse. By the 10th century, Constantine's crown had become a symbol not of power, but of peril. It appeared in one satirical play of the period as an object that weighs the head until the neck breaks. It appeared in visions of mad monks who claimed they saw emperors weep when forced to wear it. And it appeared in iconophile prophecy as the crown that kills the soul that wears it. Whether one believes in curses or not, the symbolism was clear. The man who tried to control the divine had left behind a legacy of silence, sickness, and shame. The rotting crown, once the emblem of a victorious emperor, now lay in darkness, untouched, unclaimed. And in that stillness, Byzantium remembered. Not through words, not through monuments, but through absence. History remembers emperors in two ways: through the monuments they build, and through the myths they leave behind. Constantine V left neither untouched. His policies reshaped an empire. His armies defended its borders. His laws restructured its bureaucracy. But those achievements, real and consequential, are rarely what people recall when they hear his name. Instead, they remember the man who blinded his enemies, who declared war on saints, who burned icons and silenced prayer. They remember the emperor who, despite all his might, could not stop his own flesh from falling apart. It is said that absolute power isolates, and in Constantine's case, it consumed. He began as a prince with vision, trained in logic, faith, and war. A man raised in the crucible of an empire under siege. He could have ruled as a philosopher king. He could have led a renaissance of faith and learning. Instead, he chose to purge rather than persuade, to control the soul of Byzantium by force of decree and blade. Why? Was it conviction, fear, a twisted sense of duty? Or was it something deeper? The belief that if he just crushed enough images, spilled enough blood, eliminated enough monks, that he might silence the doubts that lived inside him. Because Constantine V, for all his brutality, was not aimless. His war on icons was not random cruelty. It was ideological. It was methodical. It was systematic. And that's what makes his story more terrifying than the tales of mad kings or tyrants drunk on power. He believed in what he was doing. And he believed it even as his eyes clouded, even as maggots fed on his legs, even as priests avoided his bedside. He believed it while crying out to saints he had outlawed, while lashing out at phantoms only he could see. In the end, Constantine V was not killed by sword or treason or war. He was undone by time, by flesh, and by the very symbols he tried to erase. His body, rotted by disease, became a metaphor too perfect for his enemies to ignore, a living judgment from the heavens. The man who tore saints from walls became the man haunted by saints in his dreams. But perhaps the greatest punishment was not divine. Perhaps it was historical. Because Constantine V, for all his reforms, all his victories, all his power, is remembered not as a savior, but as a cautionary tale. His name survives mostly in whispers, in footnotes, in sermons that warn against hubris. He is studied by theologians, but rarely celebrated by priests. His tomb is intact, but unattended. His titles are known, but rarely spoken with reverence. And in this forgetting, there is a different kind of justice. We often think of history as memory, But history is also selective silence. It chooses what to amplify and what to abandon. Constantine V, the man who tried to control memory itself by banning icons, has become an emperor remembered through images he could never destroy. The bleeding saints, the burned monks, the blinded rebels, and the worms that took his eyes. He tried to shape how the world would remember him. But he forgot one truth. You cannot command what people remember. You can only influence what they forget. And so, as the centuries passed, Constantine became the emperor without a face. No icons, no feasts, no chance of eternal memory, just the echo of a reign defined by force and a death defined by decay. In Byzantium, emperors were often measured by the titles given to them posthumously. Basil the Bulgar Slayer, Justinian the Great, Constantine the Iconoclast. That final title, Iconoclast, is both a historical label and an epitaph. It means destroyer of images. But in Constantine's case, it could also mean destroyed by the images he sought to destroy. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth of his life. That power, no matter how absolute, cannot silence belief. That armies cannot erase faith. That laws cannot eliminate memory. That even emperors, wrapped in purple robes and guarded by golden spears, will one day face the silence of a tomb and the judgment of history. We began with a question. What forces reduced one of Byzantium's most formidable emperors to such an end? Now we know. It wasn't just disease. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't just ghosts of the past. It was the empire itself, fighting to remember what he tried to make it forget. And in that, Constantine V left behind his most ironic legacy. A man who destroyed images, only to become one. The story of Constantine V is not merely a biography. It is a powerful meditation on the limits of power, the dangers of fanaticism, and the inevitability of human decay. Here was a man who believed himself to be both emperor and prophet, reformer and divine instrument, who spent his reign shaping religion with fire and steel. And yet, for all his might, he could not escape the slow, humiliating death of the flesh. In the end, his enemies did not defeat him. His own body did. His war on icons was not just theological. It was a war against memory, against tradition, and against those who dared see the sacred where he saw idolatry. And yet, it is memory, not law, that survived him. His name became a warning. His suffering became myth. His empire moved on. In Constantine's story, we are reminded that tyranny leaves scars not only on people, but on the soul of a nation, and that even the most feared rulers will one day be judged, not just by history, but by the legacy they leave behind in the hearts of their people.